In this video, we're going to have a look at how to achieve an A star in a D question. So what are the examiners expecting to see in a D question? Well, the trigger word for a D question is discuss. The first thing they're expecting to see is a range of arguments, ideally between 4 and 5, from different faiths, denominations and worldviews. These should be supported by specific and appropriate evidence or examples and have clear explanations linked back to the question. They expect to see key terms used accurately and extensively throughout your work, some critical evaluation of your points, a clear and logical structure, and you should finish your answer with a comprehensive conclusion that reflects your understanding of the points. In lessons, we talk a lot about point evidence explained structure. So before we look at a specific example, let's clarify what we mean by those things. So what is the point? Well, the point is a simple statement that outlines how a particular group or religion would respond to a particular issue or statement. Essentially what you're saying is who would agree or disagree and their reasons why. This is normally linked to a religious belief. For example, my point might read something like this. Many Catholics and Protestants would agree that the concept of the afterlife is the most important, as they believe it gives their life and religious practice a sense of purpose. Notice here that I'm making reference to a specific denomination. I've made it clear to the examiner whether my argument is agree or disagree. And I've summarised what they believe in one sentence, making reference to a belief, not a teaching at this stage. After finishing your point, you need to add evidence then to support that point that you've made. But what counts as evidence? Evidence can be a range of different things, such as religious teachings or stories, quotes from leaders, examples, statistics, or even theories like natural law and situation ethics. Don't worry about remembering loads of quotes word for word. Whilst it's good to include religious teachings, you are credited for summarising or paraphrasing, or just picking out certain key words that are relevant to the point that you've made. The examiner's not looking to see that you can remember quotes word for word. The main thing they're looking to see is how you arrived at your point and that you understand where certain beliefs have come from. This is what the evidence is there to do. It's there to support your point, not to replace it. However, there are some basic guidelines that I would suggest you follow when adding evidence. For example, if you're summarising or paraphrasing the information, try and make the source specific. For example, the parable of the sheep and the goats is too long to remember word for word. So what I want to do in the exam is summarise that, but make sure I reference exactly where it's from. I might say something like, in the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus tells the parable of the sheep and the goats, in which he encourages followers to help the thirsty, starving, homeless and imprisoned as a way of earning entry into heaven. However, it could be that I can't remember the source exactly, in which case I keep the source general, but I make the teaching specific. I could say something like, in the creation accounts it says, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. In addition, maybe you can't remember most of the teaching, but you can remember one word or phrase. So I might say something like, in Mark 10 it suggests that God expected men and women to marry and become one flesh. I'm only quoting a very short section. Worst case scenario is that you can't remember either the source or the exact wording, in which case you summarise what you can remember. Some evidence is better than no evidence at all. I might say something like, in the Bible it suggests, or the teachings of Jesus imply. You can see there I'm keeping the wording very, very vague, making it clear to the examiner that this isn't a word for word quote. Finally, it could be that I'm adding a statistic rather than a teaching or a quote. In which case what I would do is make my source specific and if possible reliable, and then I would quote their findings. I might say something like, for example, statistics published by the police saw a 41% increase in religious or racially motivated crimes. You can see both my source and my statistic. However, a word of warning, if you want to show the examiner that you're an A-star student, don't overuse simple teachings like love thy neighbour that they're going to see time and time again. Remember, there are alternatives available like Fletcher in Situation Ethics, who suggested love is the only ruling norm of Christian decision making, or Jesus breaking the Sabbath laws to do the most loving thing. These sound much, much fancier. After you've added then your evidence, you need to explain that point and link it back to the question. So what should your explanation do? Essentially, what you're doing in the explanation is you're telling the examiner what your evidence tells you and how that helps you address the issue or problem identified in the question. This shows the examiner your ability to interpret and apply the information, which is where your marks are. Develop your explanation by making reference to practice, i.e. what believers do. You might find it useful to get into the habit of using certain words or phrases in your explanation to just signpost it for the examiner. For example, I might say something like, conservative Christians interpret this to mean that, and as such they will do this. Finally then, to boost your marks and access the top grade boundaries, it's useful to evaluate some of your points. There are 2 ways that you can do this. You're already doing the first way by providing arguments for and against. The second, more challenging way of evaluating is actually thinking about the validity or credibility of the arguments. I would recommend that you add 2 evaluations in, ideally your first paragraph and your last paragraph, as that's the first thing the examiners read and the last thing they see before the conclusion. When critically evaluating your points, you might consider some of the following. You might look at the source, where it comes from and the status that it has. You might consider the date that it was produced and whether or not it's still followed in society. You might also consider the purpose, i.e. why it was written, and the intended audience. You might consider the impact that it has on religious practice and whether actually it still influences what a believer does. And finally, you might look at the extent to which it helps you address the specific demands of the question. So my evaluation at the end of the paragraph might look something like this. For conservative Christians, this is a highly reliable argument as it comes from the Bible, which is the Word of God, and that's the main source of authority in their lives. You can see there that what I'm trying to do is use evaluative language to flag up evaluation to the examiner by using phrases like highly reliable. So let's have a look at an example. In this question, it gives you the statement, the belief in the afterlife is the most important one. Discuss this statement showing you've considered more than one point of view. The first thing I would recommend that you do is that you highlight your trigger word. On this occasion, it's discuss. This suggests then that you need a range of different arguments to respond to the statement. It also tells you that you need more than one point of view. We recommend that you do between 4 and 5 different arguments. Notice here that they're asking for both religious and non-religious beliefs. This won't be the same in every D question that you come across in the paper, therefore you need to read the questions really carefully. Only in the first philosophy unit will they explicitly reference religious and non-religious beliefs. I'd also recommend that you highlight some of the words or phrases in the statement itself. On this occasion, I'd highlight most important. In your explanations, you need to make clear and direct reference back to that phrase. You can see there that the question is worth 15 marks. Like all the other questions in the exam, you have a minute a mark, so that gives you 15 minutes to answer this question. However, if you can save any time on your A, B and C questions, I'd recommend that any additional time that you have available, you spend focusing on these D questions. Once you've read and annotated the D question, you might find it useful to just spend around 60 seconds producing a plan of arguments for and arguments against. Your plan here is not going to be as detailed as the plans that we do in lesson time. It's just going to be simple words or phrases that help you structure your response when you come to write it. Notice that your answer doesn't need to be balanced. The examiner is only looking for different points of view. It could be that you have 1 agree and 4 disagree. As long as they're different arguments with different pieces of evidence, that's absolutely fine. Now in these D questions, I don't need to add an introduction, so I'm going to go straight in with my first point. Many Roman Catholics and Protestants would agree that the belief in the afterlife is most important, as they claim that it gives their life and evangelism purpose. Notice that I'm making reference to a specific denomination. I'm making it clear whether it's an agree or disagree point. I'm also using it as an opportunity to add in some of my key terms and show my knowledge of other areas of the course. Following my point, I then need to add evidence. So I might say something like, in 1 Corinthians 15, St. Paul suggests that if Jesus had not been raised and proven that there is life after death, then our preaching is useless and so is your faith. You can see here that I'm making my source very specific. However, a lot of what I'm saying is just a summarised version of St. Paul's teaching, and therefore I'm telling the examiner this by saying suggested. I have included, though, just a small part of the quote just to illustrate my point. I then need to explain my point and tell the examiner how that evidence relates to the question. saying this implies that the afterlife and the belief that there is life after death is the most important belief, as without it the commitment to God and the hardships Christians endure for their faith, particularly in areas of persecution, would go unrewarded. Belief in the afterlife therefore becomes vital in providing motivation and a sense of purpose in life. Notice again here I'm explicitly referencing the question and using key terms. Now, as this is my first paragraph, I want to give a really good impression to the examiner, so I've chosen to evaluate this particular paragraph. I might say something like, this is a valid argument as the emphasis placed on Jesus' resurrection and promise of life after death is reflected in Christian practices, particularly the sacrament of Eucharist. You can see here again that I'm using evaluative language to try and emphasise and just flag up that evaluation to the examiner. Now it's up to you whether you do all of your agree points first and then your disagrees, or whether you ping pong your arguments. On this occasion I've chosen to do a disagree, but I'm also choosing to do a non-religious view just to make sure that I'm meeting the demands of the question set. So I might say something like, on the other hand, humanists may disagree as they believe that there is little evidence to support religious claims and thus reject the concept of the afterlife. You can see that I'm flagging this up as a counter-argument to the examiner by saying phrases like, on the other hand. Again, then I need to add evidence. On this occasion, it's not going to be a religious teaching because obviously humanists don't believe in religious teachings. Instead, I'm going to go for the work of a scholar. So I might say something like, highly respected humanist and scholar Richard Dawkins said that faith is a great cop-out and described religious beliefs about God and the afterlife as infantile. Another way that you can flag up evaluation is by using phrases like highly respected, as that gives my evidence credibility. I then need to explain that evidence and again link it back to the question, saying something like, as such, humanists argue that the lack of evidence shows that there is no God, and that any belief in him or life after death is simply a human construct made to give us a sense of comfort and hope. Consequently, they conclude that the afterlife cannot be the most important belief. They instead focus on science and rational reasoning. Notice again that I'm making a very clear and explicit reference back to the question. So I want to continue my answer now, given a wider range of arguments for and against. We're aiming for between 4 and 5 in total. I might say something like, many traditional Christians may however agree that the afterlife is the most important belief, as they believe that it helps instill a moral code or justice system in society. For example, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus reminds his followers that only those who behave morally or who are righteous will gain eternal life. Renowned philosopher Kant also suggested that the afterlife is important if we are to believe that true justice will be served. As such, the belief in the afterlife is most important because the hope of reward or fear of punishment encourages people to behave morally, which in turn benefits society. Now I'm going to add another agree paragraph that further supports the point I've just made. Muslims would also agree as they believe that everything in life is a test from Allah. The Quran states, "Be sure we shall test you." As such, the belief in the afterlife is vital for them as a means of ensuring moral behaviour, but also providing a sense of justice and reward for their commitment during challenging times. Finally then, time permitting, I'm going to add one final paragraph. I might say something like, finally, many Muslims would disagree that the afterlife is the most important belief, as they believe that one should not act morally simply for reward. Instead, for them, the most important belief is the belief in Allah and their submission to him. Throughout their lives, Muslims state the Shahada, arguably the most important pillar, saying, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. The Shahada is recited through daily lives and important milestones such as conversion or reversion. No other belief is expressed as much. This suggests that it's in fact their monotheistic belief in Allah that is most important and helps give Muslims their religious identity. Now, as this is my final paragraph, I'm also choosing to evaluate this one, so it's the last thing that the examiner reads before my conclusion. This is a highly valid argument, as reciting the Shahada spans the whole Muslim history from the early prophets right up to contemporary Muslims today. Now, once you've finished your 4 to 5 arguments, it's essential that you add a conclusion. Your conclusion shouldn't include any new information. However, I'd also recommend that you avoid really basic or simple conclusions like the example I've given here, by saying something like, in conclusion, I believe that the afterlife is most important because that's where all religious believers aim to be. Whilst that might be true, it's overly simplistic and doesn't show your ability to weigh up the evidence that you've provided. This is your last chance to make a really good impression in these D questions, so I would try and really amp up your critical evaluation. I would say something like, based on critical evaluation of the evidence, it is clear that for religious believers, the afterlife is the most important belief, as it encapsulates the ultimate aim and instills a sense of purpose or justice needed to help them endure many of the hardships that come from being a believer. Whilst there may be little empirical evidence of its existence, the afterlife can provide a sense of hope and comfort for all. So you can see here that I'm making a very clear reference back to the question. I'm showing the examiner that I've weighed up the evidence, but I'm also making a very clear and definitive judgment. I'm not sitting on the fence at all. I would recommend that you practice planning and answering as many D questions as possible. During the practice questions, both in lessons and at home, you might find it useful to use this quarter writing frame. This basically gives you openers that you could use for your points, your evidence, your explanations, and your evaluations. So I hope you find it useful. So let's just do a really quick recap then of how we approach these D questions. The first thing you need to do is read the question really carefully and highlight the most important words or phrases. Spend then around 60 seconds just doing a really quick plan so that you structure your arguments well. Then you spend the majority of your time writing between 4 to 5 arguments using that point, evidence, explain, link, evaluate structure. And then you add a conclusion given a very firm judgment.